This is one of those sermons, let me just say up front, one of those sermons that I had trouble with. That's not unusual. I often have trouble with sermons, particularly if they're bad sermons. Or if they just trouble me. I have trouble with them. Which brings up a good point. And that is, if you find that you are troubled by a sermon, then it's probably a good indication that you need to spend a little more time with it. Reflecting on it, rolling it over in your mind and in your life, and seeing what's causing you trouble about it. So this may be one that troubles you. It has less answers in it, not unusual for me, I know, but more questions. As I prepared for this, I haven't read the commentaries and the background material on the passage from Acts, this 5th chapter. There seemed some sort of blockage was in my way as I sat down to begin putting things together, putting thoughts down on paper. I had a sense of what needed to be said, but something was troubling me, holding me back. My thinking would go off in a particular direction which seemed like a fine place to be for a sermon for me, and then I'd find myself pulled back to a nagging problem with the text. And here's the problem in a nutshell. What would you do if your scriptures taught you that violence is okay? Now, this passage doesn't present violence per se. What would you do if your religious tradition taught you that violence against another human being is okay? It raises the question of, so when is violence against another human being okay? Is it ever? Peter says to the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, we must obey God rather than men. Oftentimes, such language has been used to justify bad behavior on the part of those who use that language. But it raises a question for me of what obedience is owed to a God who condones violence against the very creation God has created. What's poignant about this text on this day of Yom HaShoah, or the Jewish Day of remembrance of a very tragic time in world history, time of Holocaust for the Jewish people. An atrocity of history of humankind that in some way traces its origins back to this text. How is that, we might ask? Another question. What are the responsibilities of those who follow teachings that lead to such acts of violence and murder as the Holocaust? How do we respond to violence? But a more nagging question becomes a bit too obvious here. How do we respond to religious violence or violence perpetrated in the name of religion or in the name of God? And what happens if we discover that what we believe creates violence for other people? Is that okay? Is that ever okay? You see, it's beyond me how any person could ever come to the conclusion that in order to further the cause of their own religion, that it's okay to cause another person harm. So how do we make a bold proclamation, which is what the passage in Acts is about, as Peter and the apostles gather after Jesus' death, after the stories of his resurrection have begun to circulate, and they move out into their Jewish communities because they're Jewish people. And they begin to talk about the teachings of Jesus. And crowds begin to flock to them because people are being healed.